Chapter 1, The Broken Daughter. The scream that pierced through Ravencrest Manor at 3 a.m. could shatter glass, but it barely cracked Theron Nightfall's heart anymore. He stood in the marble hallway outside his daughter's room, his ancient hands trembling as the 100th healer emerged, shaking his head in defeat. "I'm sorry, Lord Nightfall. The curse runs too deep. Even my strongest blood magic cannot reach her." The healer's voice cracked with genuine sorrow as he gathered his silver instruments, each one having failed to stop 17-year-old Seraphina's agony. Through the heavy oak doors, another shriek echoed, followed by the sound of furniture splintering against stone walls. Theron's crimson eyes that had witnessed 1,000 years of vampire politics and war, filled with tears he refused to shed. His only daughter, his precious Seraphina, had been cursed by a dying werewolf 3 months ago, and every full moon brought torture that no amount of vampire healing could cure. The mansion's grand staircase creaked under the weight of despair as Theron descended, his footsteps echoing in the vast foyer lined with portraits of Nightfall ancestors. Servants scattered like shadows when they saw their master's face, a mask of controlled fury and helplessness that terrified even the bravest among them. In his private study, surrounded by leather-bound grimoires and ancient artifacts, Theron stared at the list he'd memorized: Master Aldrich the Bloodweaver, Sorceress Morgana Blackthorn, High Priest Cassius of the Moon Cult, all the most powerful healers in the supernatural world, all failures. His daughter's screams continued to pierce the night, each one driving another stake through his undead heart. The curse was unlike anything documented in vampire lore. A werewolf's dying vengeance that turned his pure-blood daughter's body against itself, causing her vampire healing to attack her own flesh during lunar peaks. Miles away in the shadowed alleys of the lower district, 19-year-old Ember Ashworth pressed her back against cold brick, rain soaking through her threadbare coat as she clutched a stolen loaf of bread to her chest. Her unusual silver-blue eyes that had always marked her as different, as dangerous, scanned the darkness for the shop owner who'd been chasing her for 3 blocks. Her gift, the one that had cost her everything, pulsed weakly in her palms, the ability to absorb and heal any pain, any injury, any curse, but at a terrible cost to herself. The noble families had cast her out when they discovered her power, calling her a witch, a freak, a danger to their pure bloodlines. Now she survived on scraps and shadows, her healing gift more curse than blessing, attracting desperate souls who used her until she nearly died, then discarded her like trash. But tonight, as the full moon blazed overhead, something in the air felt different, electric, urgent, calling to the strange power that hummed in her bones. The rain hammered against the mansion's windows as Theron made a decision that went against every vampire instinct he possessed. His daughter's condition was worsening. The family physician had whispered that she might not survive another moon cycle. Traditional healing had failed, blood magic had failed, even the ancient vampire councils had no answers. With his heart breaking and his pride shattered, Theron realized he had only one option left: venture into the mortal world and seek help from those his kind considered beneath them. He'd heard whispers in the supernatural underground about healers who worked in the shadows, desperate souls with unusual gifts who survived on the edges of society. It was a path that could destroy his reputation among vampire nobility, but as another of Seraphina's screams tore through the night, Theron knew he would sacrifice everything: his status, his pride, even his own existence, for even the smallest chance to save his daughter. The ornate clock in the foyer struck 4 as Theron's decision crystallized into action, his crimson eyes burning with desperate determination. He would find this mysterious healer the street whispers spoke of, a young woman with silver eyes who could cure the incurable but lived like a ghost in the lower district. Unknown to him, in those same rain-soaked alleys, Ember was following a pull she didn't understand, her healing gift resonating with a pain so profound it called to her across the city like a beacon. Neither knew that fate was weaving their stories together, that before dawn broke over Ravencrest Manor, everything they thought they knew about healing, about power, and about the boundaries between vampire and human would be shattered forever. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of their old lives as destiny prepared to collide their worlds in ways that would echo through eternity. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 3 years earlier, Ember Ashworth had been the beloved daughter of House Ashworth, living in silk gowns and marble halls, her unusual silver-blue eyes considered a mark of noble distinction. But everything changed the night she instinctively reached out to heal her dying mother, absorbing the cancer that had been eating Lady Ashworth alive for months. The family physician had declared it impossible when her mother's tumor simply vanished, but the black veins crawling up Ember's arms told a different story. Her father, Lord Ashworth, had stared in horror as his teenage daughter collapsed, her body racked with the agony she'd stolen from her mother. "What have you done?" he'd whispered, backing away as if she carried plague. The noble council arrived within hours, their faces grim with ancient prejudices against unexplained magic. They declared her a dangerous anomaly, a threat to the natural order, and her own father, the man who'd once called her his precious jewel, signed the banishment papers without meeting her eyes. The transition from velvet cushions to gutters had nearly killed her, but Ember's gift made her too valuable to die quietly. Desperate souls in the lower district sought her out, mothers with dying children, laborers crushed by machinery, plague victims ignored by proper physicians. Each healing drained her further, leaving her weaker, hungrier, more hollow than before. She learned to charge just enough to buy bread and shelter, but the wealthy clients who could afford real payment always vanished once their loved ones were healed, leaving her with copper coins and empty promises. The worst were those who tried to force her gift, holding her captive until she agreed to heal their conditions. Bruises around her wrists had become permanent reminders of how quickly desperation could turn violent. But she couldn't stop healing, couldn't ignore suffering when she had the power to end it, even when each use of her ability carved away another piece of her own life force. Tonight felt different as Ember huddled in the abandoned warehouse she called home, her silver eyes reflecting moonlight streaming through broken windows. The rain created a steady rhythm against the corrugated roof while she nursed her latest collection of borrowed ailments, a child's fever she'd absorbed that morning, an old man's arthritis from the afternoon, and the lingering ache of a woman's broken ribs from the previous evening. Her gift worked by taking the injury or illness completely into herself, allowing her body to process and eliminate it over time. But healing others left her constantly carrying a catalog of pain that would kill normal people. She'd learned to manage it, to spread the absorption across days or weeks, but the loneliness was harder to bear than the physical agony. No one stayed once they were healed, no one cared about the girl who saved them at the cost of her own wellness, and her noble upbringing felt like a dream from someone else's life. The sound of expensive boots on cobblestone made Ember's head snap up, her survival instincts honed by 3 years of hiding from both desperate clients and noble enforcers who still considered her a threat. Through the warehouse's grimy windows, she glimpsed a figure moving through the rain, tall, elegant, wearing a coat that cost more than most people earned in a year. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the bearing of vampire nobility, the predatory grace that marked the supernatural elite who ruled from their hidden towers above the city. Vampires and nobles both viewed her kind as tools at best, threats at worst, and being discovered by either usually meant imprisonment or worse. But something about this figure's movements seemed different, not the calculated hunt of a predator, but the desperate search of someone who'd lost everything. Still, Ember pressed deeper into the shadows, her hand instinctively covering the silver pendant her mother had given her, the last piece of her old life that she'd managed to keep. Through the rain-streaked window, Ember watched the stranger pause directly outside her hiding place, his pale face turned upward as if he could sense her presence through walls and darkness. Her gift stirred uneasily in her chest, responding to something in the air, a pain so vast and ancient it made her borrowed ailments feel like pinpricks. This wasn't the sharp agony of physical injury or the slow burn of disease, but something deeper. The soul-crushing anguish of a parent watching their child suffer beyond their power to help. Despite every survival instinct screaming at her to run, Ember found herself drawn to the window, her healing gift reaching out like a compass needle toward magnetic north. The stranger's eyes met hers through the glass, crimson irises that burned with desperate hope and terror in equal measure. In that moment, Ember realized her quiet life in the shadows was about to end, and whatever this vampire lord wanted from her would either be her salvation or her destruction. Chapter 2: The Vampire's Desperate Gamble. Theron Nightfall had never set foot in the lower district in his 1,000 years of existence, but desperation had a way of shattering even the oldest prejudices. The rain that soaked through his expensive coat felt like ice against his marble-cold skin as he followed whispered directions through twisting alleys that reeked of desperation and decay. His crimson eyes, evolved to track prey through darkness, scanned every shadow for the girl the street informants described: silver eyes, healing hands, living like a ghost among the forgotten. The vampire lord's pride screamed at him for this humiliation, crawling through mortal gutters seeking help from a cast-off human. But Seraphina's scream still echoed in his ears, drowning out everything else. Each step through the muddy streets was a betrayal of his noble standing, but love for his daughter had reduced him to this, a desperate father willing to beg anyone, anywhere, for even the smallest hope of relief. The irony wasn't lost on him that 20 years ago, he'd walked these same streets under very different circumstances, visiting a human noblewoman whose memory still haunted his dreams. The abandoned warehouse loomed before him like a monument to mortal failure, its broken windows and rusted walls speaking of dreams that had crumbled into dust. But Theron's supernatural senses caught something that made his ancient heart skip: the scent of power, wild and untrained but potent enough to make his vampire instincts take notice. Inside that crumbling building was magic unlike anything he'd encountered in centuries of supernatural politics. Raw and primal and somehow familiar in a way that made his teeth ache. His daughter's curse had resisted every form of healing the vampire world could offer, but this power felt different, not the structured magic of trained sorcerers or the blood rituals of his own kind, but something that existed outside the rules entirely. Hope and terror warred in his chest as he approached the warehouse, knowing that this girl represented either Seraphina's salvation or his final, crushing defeat. The familiarity of the magical signature tugged at memories he'd buried deep, of another time when he'd encountered power that defied classification. Through rain-blurred windows, Theron saw her, a slip of a girl pressed against the far wall, silver eyes wide with fear and recognition. The moment those unusual eyes met his crimson ones, the world tilted on its axis as recognition crashed over him like a supernatural tsunami. Those eyes, he knew those eyes. Not from street rumors or whispered descriptions, but from the portrait that hung in his private chambers, hidden behind a false panel where no one else could find it. Lady Celestine Ashworth's eyes, captured by the finest artist in the realm 20 years ago, stared back at him from this starving girl's face with impossible familiarity. Her clothes were threadbare, her face gaunt with hunger, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to survive on scraps and shadows. But the bone structure was unmistakably Celestine's, the delicate features he'd traced with reverent fingers during stolen midnight hours. This was the healer who could supposedly cure the incurable. This broken girl who looked like she needed healing more than she could provide it. This was his daughter, the child he'd never known existed. The revelation hit him with the force of a supernatural earthquake, memories flooding back of his secret affair with Lady Celestine Ashworth during the dark months before his arranged marriage to Seraphina's mother. Celestine had been everything vampire nobility deemed forbidden: human, passionate, alive in ways that made his undead heart remember what beating felt like. They'd met in shadows and loved in secret, their affair burning bright and desperate until duty and politics tore them apart. He'd been forced into his vampire marriage to cement political alliances, while Celestine had been promised to a human lord of her father's choosing. The last time he'd seen her, tears had streamed down her face as she'd whispered that their love was impossible, that their worlds would never allow them to be together. 3 months later, he'd heard of her death in childbirth, but he'd assumed the child had died with her. Vampire human pregnancies were notoriously dangerous, with survival rates that made most couples avoid the risk entirely. Now, staring through rain-soaked glass at silver eyes that mirrored his lost loves, Theron realized his assumption had been catastrophically wrong. The mathematical certainty of it stole his breath. 19 years old, born exactly 9 months after their last night together, carrying the distinctive silver eyes that marked Celestine's bloodline and the raw magical power that spoke of vampire heritage. This girl wasn't just any healer, she was his daughter, his own flesh and blood, cast out by the very family that should have protected her. The irony was devastating. He'd come seeking a stranger to save Seraphina, only to discover he was asking one daughter to save another, using a child he'd never known existed to heal the child he'd raised as his own. No wonder her power felt familiar. It carried traces of his own vampire magic, filtered through Celestine's bridge blood heritage and transformed into something unprecedented. Half vampire, half bridge blood human, she represented a combination that shouldn't exist according to every law of supernatural genetics, yet here she stood, living proof that love could create miracles even when it destroyed everything else. Against every instinct of vampire nobility, Theron found himself pressing his palm against the cold window glass, his crimson eyes pleading with the girl inside, his daughter inside. He could smell her fear, hear her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that echoed his own when he'd been young enough to feel such things, but beneath the terror was something else, a pull toward the pain she sensed in him, as if her healing gift was responding to his anguish despite her conscious desire to flee. "Please," he mouthed through the glass, the word tasting like ash in his mouth as he realized he was begging his own child for help, a child who had no idea who he was or what she meant to him. A vampire lord begging a mortal girl, it went against every law of their hierarchy, every rule that had governed supernatural society since the beginning. But his daughter's face swam before his vision, beautiful Seraphina with her mother's gentle smile, now twisted in agony no cure could touch, and behind her, overlaying the image like a double exposure, came another daughter's face, Celestine's features refined and strengthened by 20 years of survival. Pride meant nothing when measured against love, and Theron would grovel in the dirt if it meant even the smallest chance of saving both his daughters. The warehouse door creaked open with rusty protest, and Theron stepped inside, rain dripping from his expensive coat onto broken concrete as he prepared for the most difficult conversation of his millennium-long existence. The girl. Ember, according to his informants, though he wondered if she knew the significance of a name that meant burning light in the old tongue, remained pressed against the far wall, ready to bolt if he moved too quickly. Up close. She looked even more like Celestine, but also carried traces of his own features in the aristocratic line of her jaw and the predatory grace that marked vampire heritage even in diluted form. The power radiating from her was undeniable, making the air itself feel charged with possibility, and now he understood why. She carried the combined magical legacy of two ancient bloodlines, vampire strength merged with bridge blood adaptability to create something entirely new. "I know what you are," she whispered, her voice carrying the cultured accent of noble birth despite her current circumstances, and Theron's heart clenched as he heard echoes of Celestine's musical tones. "Vampire lords don't visit the lower district unless someone's about to die." The words hung between them like a blade, and Theron realized she was right in ways she couldn't imagine. Someone was dying. Someone was desperate, someone was about to discover truths that would reshape their entire understanding of family and power. "My daughter," he said simply, his voice cracking on words that carried double meaning now. "She's dying, and you're my last hope." But even as he spoke about Seraphina, his eyes drank in every detail of the girl before him, cataloging the ways she resembled her mother and the subtle signs of vampire heritage that explained her incredible healing abilities. The rain continued to fall around them, washing away the last of his pride as he prepared to lay his heart bare before this stranger who was no stranger at all, this healer who carried his blood and Celestine's memory, this daughter he'd lost before he'd ever known he had her. How could he tell her the truth? How could he explain that the vampire lord seeking her help was also the father who'd never known she existed? How could he make her understand that saving Seraphina meant embracing a heritage that had been stolen from her by politics and prejudice? "There's something you need to know," Theron began carefully, his ancient mind racing through the implications of revelation and the dangers of continued secrecy. Ember's silver eyes, Celestine's eyes, watched him with wariness born of years spent being used and discarded by those who claimed to care about her. She'd learned not to trust easily, and he couldn't blame her for the suspicion that radiated from her small frame like armor. "About your family, about your power," about why you can do things that other healers cannot." The words felt heavy as stones, weighted with 20 years of ignorance and loss, with the terrible knowledge that his daughter had suffered in gutters while he'd lived in luxury, unaware of her existence. "Your mother," he continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, "was Lady Celestine Ashworth. And your father." He paused, meeting her eyes with the full weight of centuries behind his gaze. "Your father is standing before you now, seeking help from the daughter he never knew he had, hoping against hope that one daughter can save another before it's too late." The silence that followed his confession stretched like a chasm between worlds, filled with the sound of rain against broken windows and the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to echo the supernatural storm brewing in the warehouse. Ember's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, shock, anger, and something that might have been desperate hope before settling into the careful blankness that had kept her alive on the streets. "You're lying," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction, and Theron could see the recognition in her eyes as she processed the resemblance she'd probably noticed but never dared to hope meant anything. "My father was Lord Edmund Ashworth. He cast me out when my powers manifested. He signed the banishment papers himself." But even as she spoke the words, Theron could see doubt creeping in, the understanding that his revelation explained too many things that had never made sense: her incredible healing abilities, her resistance to supernatural influences, the way vampire magic responded to her touch as if recognizing kinship. "Edmund Ashworth was the man your mother married," Theron said gently, his voice carrying the weight of confession and regret. "But he was not the man who fathered you. That was me, in stolen moments before duty tore us apart, in a love affair that burned bright enough to create something miraculous before politics extinguished it forever." He pulled out his phone, scrolling to a picture he'd never shown anyone, the portrait of Celestine that hung in his private chambers, her silver eyes full of love and sadness as she posed for what they'd both known would be their final gift to each other. "Look at her face, then look in any mirror. Tell me you don't see the truth written in every line, every curve, every expression that makes my heart remember what love felt like." Ember's hands trembled as she studied the image, her breath catching as the resemblance became undeniable, and Theron watched his daughter, come to terms with a heritage that changed everything about her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The revelation hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, connecting two lives that had been shaped by loss and desperation but were now offered the chance for something neither had dared hope for: family. "If this is true," Ember whispered, her voice carrying the careful hope of someone who'd learned that dreams could be weapons turned against the dreamer, "then why didn't you come for me? Why didn't you know I existed? Why did you let me suffer in the streets while you lived in your mansion?" The questions hit Theron like physical blows, each one deserved and devastating, but he forced himself to meet her gaze as he answered with the honesty she deserved. "Because I thought you'd died with your mother. Because the reports I received said the child hadn't survived the birth. Because I was a coward who let politics and duty override love, and by the time I realized my mistakes, it was too late to correct them." His voice broke on the admission, centuries of regret flooding out in words that could never undo the damage but might begin to heal the wounds. "I failed you before you were born, failed your mother when she needed me most, and I've been failing you every day since by not knowing you were alive." The warehouse felt charged with supernatural energy as father and daughter faced each other across 20 years of separation and loss, the rain hammering against broken windows like the tears neither was quite ready to shed. Ember's power pulsed in response to the emotional turmoil, reaching toward Theron's ancient pain with instincts that transcended conscious thought, and he felt something in his undead heart stir that he'd thought was permanently dormant: hope for redemption, for family, for the chance to be the father he'd never had the opportunity to become. "Seraphina," Ember said finally, her voice steady despite the revelations that had shattered her understanding of her own identity. "You said she's dying. That's why you're here, why you need my help." She straightened, and Theron saw strength in her posture that reminded him of both Celestine's determination and his own refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. "If she's my half-sister, if she's family, then of course I'll try to help her. But I want the truth from now on, no more secrets, no more lies, no more politics that put innocent people in danger. The truth, Theron agreed, his voice carrying the weight of solemn vows as he realized that this broken girl, his daughter, his miracle, his greatest failure and his last hope, was offering him something he'd thought lost forever, the chance to choose love over duty, family over politics, redemption over the comfortable lies that had governed his existence for centuries. Always, from this moment forward. You deserve that much and more. The rain began to slow outside, as if the storm that had brought them together was finally moving on, leaving behind the possibility of clear skies and new beginnings. But first, he continued, extending his hand toward the daughter he'd never known but would now die to protect, let me take you home. Let me introduce you to your sister, and let me begin the process of making amends for 20 years of absence. As Ember hesitated for just a moment before placing her hand in his, Theron felt the first stirring of something he'd thought dead forever, the possibility that love could triumph over the mistakes of the past, that family could be found even in the darkest places, and that sometimes the greatest miracles came disguised as the most desperate gambles. Chapter 3: The Impossible Healing. Ember's first instinct was to run. Vampire lords meant danger, meant being used and discarded like every other desperate soul who'd found her in the shadows. But something in this ancient creature's crimson eyes stopped her cold, a pain so profound it made her gift ache in sympathy. Your daughter, she whispered, her back still pressed against the warehouse wall as rainwater dripped through broken windows around them. The vampire lord nodded, his marble-perfect face cracking with an anguish that seemed to echo from centuries of existence. Seraphina. She's 17, and she's been cursed by a dying werewolf. Every full moon brings agony that no vampire healing can touch. His voice broke on his daughter's name, and Ember felt her gift stir despite her fears. This wasn't the calculated manipulation she'd learned to expect from nobles, but raw parental terror that called to something deep in her healing abilities. Against every survival instinct, she found herself stepping away from the wall, drawn by the desperate love radiating from this dangerous stranger. 100 healers have tried, Theron continued, his pride crumbling with each word as he laid his failures bare before this starving girl. Blood mages, sorcerers, priests of every supernatural tradition. They all say the same thing: the curse runs too deep, binds too tightly to her vampire nature. She screams for hours during each moon cycle, and I can only hold her hand while she suffers. Ember's silver eyes widened with understanding as her gift showed her glimpses of the curse's nature: werewolf magic and vampire blood locked in eternal conflict, each trying to destroy the other while the girl caught between them paid the price. She'd never encountered anything like it, but somehow her ability was already reaching toward the problem, analyzing it with an instinct that went beyond conscious thought. The healer said only someone outside our world might succeed, Theron whispered. Someone whose gift doesn't follow the rules we understand. His crimson eyes met hers with desperate hope. You're my last chance to save her. The rain hammered against the warehouse roof as Ember struggled with the implications of what he was asking. Her gift had never failed to heal what she touched, but absorbing a curse meant for a vampire could kill her. The supernatural energies involved were beyond anything she'd ever attempted. Yet the image of a girl her own age, trapped in agony while her father watched helplessly, made her chest tighten with familiar pain. If I try this and fail, you could lose the only healer willing to attempt it, Ember said quietly, her noble upbringing showing through despite her current circumstances. And if I succeed but the curse transfers to me? She didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood. A human body couldn't survive what a vampire might endure. Theron's face went even paler, if possible, as he realized what he was asking of her. I can offer you anything: gold, protection, a home in my manor, but I won't lie about the risks. This could destroy you. Show me, Ember said suddenly, her decision crystallizing with the certainty that always accompanied her gift's calling. Take me to her. Let me see what we're dealing with before I decide. Theron's eyes flashed with hope and terror as he nodded, pulling out his phone to summon his private car. The ride through rain-soaked streets felt like a journey between worlds, from the broken alleys of the lower district to the gleaming towers where supernatural nobility ruled from hidden penthouses and ancient manors. Ember pressed her face against the bulletproof windows, watching the city transform from decay to opulence, remembering her own fall from grace and wondering if this vampire lord would discard her as easily as her own father had. But as they approached the towering gates of Ravencrest Manor, another scream pierced the night, raw, agonized, and so full of suffering that Ember's gift responded before her mind could analyze the danger. Whatever waited for her beyond those gates, she was already committed to trying. The mansion's grandeur struck Ember like a physical blow: marble staircases that spiraled toward painted ceilings, crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across silk wallpaper, oil paintings of vampire ancestors whose crimson eyes seemed to follow her every movement. But the opulence felt hollow, poisoned by the screams echoing from the upper floors that spoke of wealth's ultimate powerlessness against suffering. Servants scattered like shadows as Theron led her through corridors lined with priceless artifacts, their faces tight with the strain of months spent listening to their young lady's agony. "The screaming started an hour ago," Theron murmured as they climbed the grand staircase. "It will continue until dawn, then she'll sleep for days trying to recover." They paused outside heavy oak doors carved with protective symbols, and even through the thick wood, Ember could feel the curse like a living thing: werewolf magic and vampire blood locked in eternal war while an innocent girl paid the price. Taking a deep breath that might be her last as a fully human being, Ember nodded to Theron and stepped toward the door that would change everything. The moment Ember stepped into Seraphina's room, the curse hit her like a physical blow, wild magic tearing through the air with such intensity it made her silver eyes water and her gift scream in recognition. The chamber was a battlefield, mahogany furniture reduced to splinters, silk curtains shredded by claws that shouldn't exist on vampire hands, and in the center of the destruction lay a girl who looked like a fallen angel. Seraphina Nightfall thrashed against silver restraints, her usually pale skin mottled with black veins that pulsed in rhythm with her screams, while her father's crimson eyes identical to her own had turned completely black with pain. This wasn't just a curse, it was a war between two supernatural natures trying to occupy the same body, each one trying to destroy the other while the girl caught between them suffered beyond anything Ember had ever sensed. The werewolf's dying vengeance had been crafted specifically to torture vampires, forcing their healing abilities to attack their own flesh during lunar peaks. "Don't touch her directly," Theron warned as Ember approached the bed, his voice tight with fear for both his daughter and the girl who'd come to help them. "The curse lashes out at anyone who tries to interfere." 3 healers have been hospitalized just from skin contact. But Ember barely heard him, her gift already reaching towards Seraphina with an urgency that bypassed conscious thought. Up close, she could see the curse's true horror. The werewolf magic was forcing the girl's vampire nature to turn against itself, creating a feedback loop of agony that would continue until her supernatural healing finally gave up and let her die. It was elegant in its cruelty, designed by someone who understood both species well enough to craft the perfect torture. But as Ember studied the magical knots binding the curse together, her gift began mapping solutions with an instinct that went beyond anything she'd experienced before. This wasn't just about absorbing pain, it was about unraveling magic itself. "Seraphina," Ember whispered, kneeling beside the bed despite Theron's sharp intake of breath. The girl's thrashing slowed slightly, as if some part of her recognized the healing presence nearby, and for a moment her pain-clouded eyes focused on Ember's silver ones. "I'm going to help you," Ember said softly, reaching out her hand but stopping just short of contact. "But I need you to trust me, even though it might hurt worse before it gets better." Seraphina's response was a wordless sob that broke Ember's heart, but beneath the agony was a desperate nod of consent. The vampire girl was 17, just 2 years younger than Ember, but the curse had aged her face with suffering that made her look ancient. "She's been so brave," Theron whispered from behind them, his voice thick with pride and anguish. "Never blames me for failing to protect her, never asks why this happened. She just endures, month after month, while I watch helplessly." Ember's hand hovered inches above Seraphina's fever-hot skin, her gift analyzing the curse's structure with growing understanding. The werewolf magic had anchored itself to the girl's vampire blood, but it needed a constant source of supernatural energy to maintain its hold. If Ember could absorb not just the pain but the magical framework itself, she might be able to unravel the entire curse, but the backlash could kill her instantly. Her gift had never attempted anything this complex, and vampire magic was fundamentally different from the human ailments she usually healed. "If this doesn't work," she said quietly to Theron, "promise me you'll find another way. Don't let her suffer because I failed." Before he could respond, Ember pressed her palm against Seraphina's forehead and opened her gift completely, letting it flow into the curse with every ounce of power she possessed. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Lightning seemed to crack through her bones as werewolf magic and vampire blood poured into her human system, threatening to tear her apart from the inside. The room exploded with light as Ember's gift engaged the curse, silver fire pouring from her eyes and hands while she absorbed 3 months of accumulated agony in the space of heartbeats. Seraphina's screams cut off abruptly as the pain transferred, leaving the vampire girl gasping in blessed relief while Ember convulsed with supernatural energies that should have killed her instantly. But instead of being destroyed, her gift seemed to transform the conflicting magics, using her human nature as neutral ground where werewolf and vampire power could coexist without war. Black veins crawled up Ember's arms as she processed the curse, her body becoming a living laboratory where impossible healing took place through sheer force of will and love. "It's working," Theron breathed in amazement, watching his daughter's color return to normal while the mysterious girl who'd saved her glowed with absorbed magic. But as Ember's eyes rolled back and she collapsed beside the now peaceful Seraphina, Theron realized that healing his daughter might have cost him the most remarkable person he'd ever met, and that some victories came with prices too high to calculate. Chapter 4: The Price of Miracles. Ember drifted back to consciousness wrapped in silk sheets softer than any dream, her body aching with exhaustion but miraculously whole. Pale morning light filtered through curtains that probably cost more than she'd seen in years, and the absence of screaming felt like a blessing after months of hearing anguish echo through Ravencrest Manor's halls. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her gift had been pushed far beyond its limits, leaving her feeling like she'd absorbed the pain of an entire battlefield. But she was alive, which seemed impossible given the supernatural forces that had torn through her system during the healing. The revelation of her true parentage still felt surreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment, but the familiar ache of magical exhaustion proved that everything, the warehouse meeting, Theron's confession, the desperate healing, had been devastatingly real. She was no longer just Ember the cast-out healer, she was Ember Nightfall, daughter of two worlds, half-sister to the girl she'd saved through sheer force of will and newfound family love. "Easy," came a familiar voice, and Ember turned to see Seraphina sitting in a chair beside the bed, her color healthy and her crimson eyes bright with what appeared to be gratitude. "Father says you've been unconscious for 2 days. We weren't sure you'd wake up." The vampire girl looked completely normal now, no trace of the curse that had tormented her for months, and her smile held warmth that made Ember's chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. But there was something else in Seraphina's expression, a shadow that flickered behind her grateful facade, a tension around her eyes that spoke of secrets weighing heavy on her conscience. Ember's gift, still sensitive from the massive healing she'd performed, picked up traces of guilt radiating from her half-sister like heat from a fever. It was subtle, almost hidden beneath the genuine relief and gratitude, but unmistakably present, the kind of guilt that came from harboring knowledge that could destroy the very relationships it sought to protect. "The curse," Ember whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse as she studied Seraphina's face more carefully. "Is it really gone?" Seraphina nodded, tears of relief shining in her eyes as she leaned forward to take Ember's hand, but her grip trembled slightly with something that wasn't just emotion. "Completely. Father had 3 different healers examine me yesterday, and they can't find any trace of the werewolf magic. You did what 100 experts couldn't, you saved my life." The simple words carried such profound gratitude that Ember felt overwhelmed, and used to being valued for anything beyond her gift, but beneath the thanksgiving was an undercurrent of something darker. "But how are you still alive?" Seraphina continued, her medical curiosity showing through even as her voice carried notes of genuine fear. The amount of magical energy you absorbed should have killed any human instantly. Father's been pacing the halls like a caged wolf, terrified that saving me might have destroyed you. The concern in the vampire girl's voice was genuine, not the calculating interest Ember usually encountered from those who wanted to use her abilities, but it was also tinged with something that felt suspiciously like self-recrimination. The bedroom door opened with careful quiet, and Theron appeared carrying a tray laden with food that smelled like heaven to Ember's empty stomach. His ancient features showed relief so profound it made him look centuries younger, and his crimson eyes held an expression she was still learning to interpret from this father she'd never known. Paternal love mixed with protective fury and the bone-deep gratitude of a parent whose child had been saved from certain death. "You're awake," he said simply, setting the tray on the bedside table before studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle while simultaneously memorizing every detail of a daughter he'd thought lost forever. "My personal physician has been monitoring your vital signs. Your body processed supernatural energies that should have torn you apart, but somehow you transformed them into something harmless. It's unprecedented in vampire medical literature." He paused, his voice dropping to something almost reverent as he looked between his two daughters. "One saved, one savior. You didn't just absorb Seraphina's curse, you cured it. Permanently. The werewolf magic is gone, not suppressed or contained, but completely eliminated from her system." "I don't understand how it worked either," Ember admitted, accepting the bowl of soup Theron offered with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and the lingering effects of channeling energies that should have destroyed her. "My gift has never done anything like that before. Usually I just absorb the injury or illness and process it over time, but this felt different, like I was rewriting the magic itself instead of just taking it on." The soup tasted like ambrosia after days of unconsciousness, rich with herbs and nutrients designed to restore someone who'd pushed their supernatural abilities beyond all reasonable limits. She realized this was the best meal she'd had since her exile from noble society, but more than that, it was the first time in years someone had cared enough to ensure her recovery was complete rather than just adequate. Maybe it was because the curse involved two conflicting supernatural natures, Seraphina suggested thoughtfully, but her voice carried a strange note of forced casualness, as if she was working to keep the conversation on safe theoretical ground. "Your human essence provided neutral ground where they could coexist long enough for your gift to unravel the binding magic." Seraphina's theory made sense from a magical perspective, but Ember's heightened sensitivity was picking up something that didn't align with the academic discussion. Her half-sister was holding something back, something significant enough to make her pulse quicken, and her scent carried the distinctive tang of anxiety masked by forced calm. "Tell me about the werewolf," Ember said suddenly, her healer's instincts recognizing the importance of understanding the source of any magical ailment. "How did you encounter it? Father mentioned it was dying when it cursed you, but the specifics might help us understand why my gift reacted so differently this time." The question hit Seraphina like a physical blow, and Ember watched her half-sister's face cycle through a series of micro-expressions: panic, calculation, resignation, and finally a kind of desperate determination that suggested she was about to make a choice that would change everything between them. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Seraphina spoke, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared at her hands rather than meeting Ember's silver eyes. "The werewolf didn't attack me randomly," she began, each word seeming to cost her something precious. "I sought it out. I found it in the deep woods beyond the estate, already dying from silver poisoning, and I—" Her voice cracked as the confession poured out like blood from a reopened wound. "I begged it to curse me. I got down on my knees in the mud and pleaded with a dying creature to make me unmarriageable, to give me a condition so terrible that no vampire lord would want me as a bride." Theron's face went ashen as the implications hit him, the tray in his hands beginning to tremble as his daughter's words rewrote everything he thought he knew about the past months of agony. "The arranged marriage," he breathed, understanding flooding his features with horror. "Lord Malakar's proposal. You were trying to escape the betrothal." "You don't understand," Seraphina said desperately, finally looking up to meet their shocked gazes as tears began streaming down her pale cheeks. "Lord Malakar is a monster. The stories about what he does to his wives, how they disappear after a few years, how he treats women like possessions to be used and discarded. I couldn't face that fate. I thought a temporary curse would be better than a lifetime of horror. Her voice rose with the pain of months spent carrying this secret, the guilt of watching her father suffer while knowing she was the architect of her own torment. The werewolf warned me that dying curses were unpredictable, that it might be stronger than I expected, but I was so desperate I didn't care. I told myself that any price was worth paying to avoid becoming Malakar's property. The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the relief and gratitude that had filled the room just moments before. Ember felt as if the world had shifted beneath her, the revelation recontextualizing everything about the healing she'd performed and the family she'd thought she'd found. Her half-sister, the innocent victim she'd risked her life to save, had orchestrated her own suffering in a desperate gambit to avoid an even worse fate. The irony was devastating. Ember had used her gift to heal a curse that Seraphina had actively sought, had nearly died saving someone from a trap of their own making. The pain was real, Seraphina continued, her voice breaking as she tried to explain the inexplicable. I thought I could control it, manage it somehow, but the curse was so much stronger than I anticipated. Every full moon brought agony that made me want to die, and I realized I'd traded one nightmare for another. But by then it was too late. The werewolf was dead, the curse was set, and I couldn't undo what I'd done without admitting to father that I'd caused his months of torment through my own selfish desperation. Theron's face was a mask of conflicting emotions as he processed his daughter's confession, anger at her deception warring with understanding of her desperation, grief for the months of unnecessary suffering battling with protectiveness for a child who'd felt so trapped she'd chosen magical torture over political marriage. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of a father's heartbreak. "Why didn't you trust me to find another way? I would have moved heaven and earth to protect you from Malakar, would have faced the entire vampire council before I let him force you into marriage." Seraphina's laugh was bitter and broken, filled with the cynicism of someone who'd learned too young that good intentions often collided with political reality. Because the betrothal contract was already signed, because Malakar had political leverage you couldn't match, because breaking the agreement would have meant war between our houses. I saw the trapped look in your eyes every time his name was mentioned, knew you were as helpless as I was but couldn't admit it. The weight of secrets and sacrifice filled the elegant bedroom like smoke, making it hard to breathe as three people grappled with the truth that had finally been dragged into the light. Ember found herself caught between sympathy for Seraphina's impossible situation and anger at the deception that had nearly cost her life. She'd poured everything she had into healing a curse that her half-sister had actively sought, had transformed herself in ways she didn't yet understand to save someone who'd chosen their own suffering over trust in family. "The guilt has been eating me alive," Seraphina whispered, her vampire composure finally cracking completely as sobs racked her small frame. Watching father pace the halls in agony, seeing him age with worry, knowing that every healer who failed was just another reminder of my selfishness. When you saved me, the relief was real, but so was the knowledge that I didn't deserve it. You nearly died fixing a problem I created through my own cowardice and pride. It wasn't cowardice, Ember said quietly, her healer's instincts responding to the genuine anguish radiating from her half-sister despite the anger and betrayal churning in her own chest. You were 17 years old, facing a future that terrified you, with no one to turn to who could change the fundamental realities of vampire politics. What you did was desperate and dangerous, but it came from a place of survival, not malice. She paused, studying Seraphina's tear-stained face as she tried to process her own complex emotions about the revelation. The question now is what we do with the truth. You're free of the curse, which means you're also free of the excuse it provided to avoid the marriage. Lord Malakar will expect the betrothal to proceed once word spreads that you've been healed. The implication hung heavy in the air. Ember's successful healing had solved one problem while potentially recreating the exact situation that had caused Seraphina to seek the curse in the first place. Theron's expression hardened with the cold fury of a vampire lord whose protective instincts had been fully activated, his ancient features settling into lines that spoke of decisions made and consequences accepted. There will be no marriage to Malakar, he said with quiet certainty that carried the weight of absolute authority. Betrothal contract or not, political consequences or not, I will not sacrifice either of my daughters to that monster's appetites. His crimson eyes blazed with paternal fire as he looked between Ember and Seraphina, seeing not political assets but beloved children worth any price to protect. The curse may be gone, but that doesn't mean we're back where we started. Ember's presence changes everything. She's not just a healer, she's my acknowledged daughter, which means she has a claim to the Nightfall inheritance and a voice in family decisions. The Vampire Council will have to recognize her status, and that recognition comes with political protections Malachar can't simply override. The implications of Theron's words began to sink in as Ember realized her newfound family status might be the key to protecting Seraphina from the fate she'd tried so desperately to avoid. A vampire lord with 2 daughters has different political options than one with a single heir, she said slowly, her mind working through the complex web of supernatural politics she was only beginning to understand. If I'm recognized as legitimate family, it changes the balance of power in any negotiation. Seraphina's eyes widened with something that might have been hope as she grasped the possibilities her confession had inadvertently created. You mean you'd? She began, then stopped, unable to voice the question that carried so much desperate need. I mean I'd stand with my sister, Ember said firmly, making a choice that felt as natural as breathing despite the revelations that had shaken her understanding of everything. Whatever happened before, whatever mistakes were made, we're family now. And family protects each other. The room fell silent except for the sound of Seraphina's quiet sobs. No longer tears of guilt and fear, but relief so profound it seemed to transform her from the inside out. Theron moved to embrace both his daughters, his ancient heart expanding to accommodate emotions he'd thought buried with Celestine centuries ago. The truth has a way of freeing us, he said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned that secrets were chains that bound not just the keeper but everyone they claimed to protect. Seraphina, your desperation was understandable, but next time trust your family to find solutions that don't require you to suffer alone. Ember, your healing gift saved more than Seraphina's life. It saved our family's future and gave us options we didn't have before. As the 3 of them held each other in the morning light, Ember realized that sometimes the most profound healing happened not through magic but through truth, forgiveness, and the radical decision to choose love over the comfortable lies that had governed their separate existences. Whatever the mechanism, Theron said finally, his voice carrying deeper meaning as he acknowledged both the magical healing and the emotional revelations that had transformed their family dynamics. You've given me back both my daughters' lives, one from a curse, one from secrets that were poisoning her soul. There's no debt in any world that could repay what you've done. His formal words carried the weight of a father's gratitude and a lord's promise, but more than that, they carried acceptance and love that Ember had never dared hope to find. The thought that had terrified and thrilled her in equal measure was now settled reality. She'd found people who valued her for more than just her gift, who would stand with her through political storms and supernatural threats, who would choose family over convenience and love over the safer distance of polite formality. Rest now, Theron continued, but his tone suggested the rest would be that of a beloved daughter recovering in her family home rather than a useful stranger recuperating before being sent on her way. When you're stronger, we'll discuss our future, all of our futures, because the 3 of us face whatever comes next together. As father and daughters settled into the comfortable quiet of a family that had found itself through crisis and confession, Ember stared out the window at the estate's manicured gardens and realized her life of running and hiding was truly over. But more than that, she understood that healing Seraphina's curse had been just the beginning. The real magic had happened in this room, through words spoken in truth and love offered without condition, through the recognition that family wasn't just about blood but about choosing to stand together when everything else fell apart. The political storms brewing on the horizon, the Vampire Council's inevitable interest in her abilities, the question of Lord Malachar's thwarted ambitions, all of that would come later. For now, it was enough to know that she was no longer alone, that Seraphina's secrets had been transformed from poison into possibility, and that sometimes the most broken people could become the strongest families if they were brave enough to choose trust over the safer option of emotional isolation. Chapter 5, secrets in silver eyes. 3 weeks at Ravencrest Manor had spoiled Ember beyond recognition. Silk gowns replaced her threadbare clothes. Gourmet meals filled the hollowness that had lived in her stomach for years, and for the first time since her exile, she felt genuinely safe. Seraphina had become the sister she'd never had, sharing books and laughter in the library while teaching her about vampire history and politics. Theron treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence, consulting her on matters of supernatural healing and ensuring she wanted for nothing. But beneath the luxury and acceptance, Ember sensed undercurrents she didn't understand, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, meaningful glances between father and daughter, and a growing awareness that her successful healing of Seraphina had implications beyond just saving one girl's life. The vampire world was taking notice of the human who could cure the incurable, and Ember was beginning to realize that notoriety in supernatural circles might be more dangerous than the anonymity she'd lost. The realization hit during a formal dinner with visiting vampire nobility, their crimson eyes assessing Ember with the calculating interest of predators evaluating prey. Lord Casimir Drackle, ancient beyond measure and cruel beyond imagination, leaned across the mahogany table with a smile that showed too many teeth. The famous healer, he purred, his accent carrying the weight of centuries. I have several subjects in my territory who could benefit from your unique talents. Perhaps we could arrange a mutually beneficial exchange? The way he said subjects made Ember's skin crawl, and she noticed Theron's jaw tighten with barely controlled anger. Lady Ember is a guest in my home, not a resource to be bartered, Theron replied coldly, but Casimir's laugh suggested he viewed the objection as temporary politeness rather than a firm refusal. The dinner continued with forced civility, but Ember felt the weight of dozens of calculating gazes, each one evaluating how her gift might serve their own agendas. After the guests departed, Ember found herself alone with Theron in his private study, surrounded by ancient books and artifacts that spoke of power accumulated over millennia. They want to use me, she said quietly, not quite making it a question. Theron nodded gravely, his crimson eyes reflecting the firelight with genuine regret. Word of what you accomplished with Seraphina has spread through every supernatural court in the region. Vampire lords who've lived for centuries with ailments they thought incurable are suddenly very interested in your abilities. He moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens as he continued. Some will offer wealth and protection in exchange for healing, but others. His voice trailed off ominously. Others will simply take what they want, viewing you as a resource to be claimed rather than a person to be respected. The protective anger in his tone surprised Ember, but it also warmed something in her chest that had been cold for years. Someone actually cared about her welfare. There's something else, Theron continued, turning back to face her with an expression that mixed worry and curiosity. The manner in which you healed Seraphina, it's unprecedented in supernatural literature. You didn't just absorb a curse, you transformed it, eliminated it completely. That level of magical manipulation suggests your gift is far more powerful than anyone realized. He pulled an ancient tome from his shelves, its leather binding cracked with age. I've been researching bloodlines, looking for any explanation of your abilities, and I found references to a lost lineage, humans who served as bridges between supernatural species, capable of harmonizing conflicting magics in ways no pureblood could achieve. Ember's heart raced as he showed her illustrations of figures with silver eyes like her own, performing healings that defied conventional understanding. If my theory is correct, you're not just a gifted human, you're the descendant of something much rarer and more valuable. The implications crashed over Ember like a wave, making her sink into one of the study's leather chairs as her mind raced through the possibilities. If she truly was from some lost magical bloodline, it explained why her gift worked differently from other healers, why she'd been able to succeed where masters of supernatural medicine had failed. But it also meant she was even more of a target than they'd realized, not just a useful tool, but potentially the last of her kind, a living treasure that ambitious vampires would kill to possess. What do we do? She whispered, looking up at Theron with trust that surprised them both. The ancient vampire lord studied her face for a long moment, his expression shifting to something protective and determined. We prepare, he said simply. Because whether you're just exceptionally gifted or the heir to forgotten magic, there are those who will stop at nothing to claim you. And I'll be damned if I let anyone harm the girl who saved my daughter. Outside the window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Ember couldn't shake the feeling that the peaceful weeks at Ravencrest Manor were about to end in ways that would test every alliance they'd built. The Vampire High Council arrived at dawn like harbingers of doom, their sleek black cars forming a motorcade that spoke of power absolute and judgment final. Ember watched from her bedroom window as figures in flowing midnight robes emerged, their faces hidden beneath ancient hoods that had witnessed the rise and fall of human empires. She'd heard whispers about the council from Seraphina, 7 vampire lords older than recorded history who governed supernatural law with iron fists and silver fangs. They answered to no earthly authority and treated even vampire nobility like chess pieces to be moved at will. The fact that they'd come personally to Ravencrest Manor, rather than summoning Theron to their hidden stronghold, suggested this visit involved matters of unprecedented importance. Ember's hands trembled as she realized she was almost certainly the reason these ancient powers had emerged from their shadowed halls, and the weight of their attention felt like standing beneath a mountain that could crush her with the slightest shift of its immense bulk. The irony wasn't lost on her that just weeks ago, she'd been a nameless healer hiding in abandoned warehouses, and now her very existence commanded the attention of beings who shaped the supernatural world with their whims. Her recent discovery of her true parentage, being Theron's daughter and Seraphina's half-sister, had given her a sense of belonging she'd never experienced, but it had also painted a target on her back that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. The council's arrival felt like a reckoning, the inevitable moment when her newfound happiness would be tested against forces far beyond her understanding or control. As she watched the ancient figures glide across the manor's grounds with predatory grace, Ember couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation would determine not just her fate, but the future of everyone she'd come to love in ways that went far deeper than simple politics or supernatural law. In the manor's grand foyer, the council assembled like judges preparing for a trial that would determine the fate of nations, their midnight robes creating pools of shadow that seemed to absorb the morning light streaming through stained glass windows. The eldest, Lord Malachar, had eyes like chips of black ice that seemed to hold the weight of millennia, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the very air tremble with ancient authority. Lord Nightfall, he intoned, his gaze finding Theron with predatory precision that suggested this meeting had been planned long before Ember's healing of Seraphina had brought her to public attention. You harbor a human whose abilities threaten the very foundations of supernatural order. The girl's power to permanently alter vampire curses represents a disruption we cannot permit to exist unchecked. His words carried implications that went beyond simple control. There was genuine fear beneath the authority, a terror that spoke of experiences so terrible they had shaped policy for centuries. Ember felt Seraphina's hand slip into hers as they listened from the staircase, hidden but close enough to hear every word that would decide her future, and she noticed her half-sister's grip was ice-cold despite her vampire nature's usual temperature regulation. Furthermore, another council member added, her voice like silk wrapped around steel as she stepped forward with movements that suggested lethal grace. Reports suggest she may be descended from the lost Ashworth lineage, bridge-bloods who once served as intermediaries between our species before they were rightfully eliminated for the threat they posed. The way she said, rightfully eliminated, sent chills through Ember's system, because it carried the weight of absolute conviction, as if the speaker had witnessed firsthand whatever horrors had justified genocide against an entire bloodline. The genetic markers are unmistakable, the council member continued, producing a crystal device that hummed with supernatural energy. Her magical signature carries the distinctive resonance patterns that our archives have tracked for over 3 centuries. Theron's response carried the controlled fury of a father protecting his family, even as he faced powers that could destroy him with a gesture, his vampire nobility warring with paternal instincts that had been awakened by discovering he had 2 daughters instead of 1. Ember saved my daughter's life when your finest healers declared her incurable. She's done nothing but good with her gift, harming no one and asking for nothing in return. His crimson eyes blazed with defiance that made Ember's heart soar with gratitude, even as terror gripped her chest at the thought of him sacrificing everything for her safety. She healed a curse that had resisted every form of supernatural medicine, transformed werewolf magic in ways that should have been impossible, and asked for nothing more than a place to belong. If that represents a threat to your natural order, perhaps your order needs examination. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, a vampire lord of ancient lineage questioning the very foundations of the council's authority. That may be, Lord Malachar replied with chilling indifference that suggested Theron's defiance had been anticipated and planned for, but her very existence destabilizes the natural order in ways you cannot comprehend. Bridgebloods were eliminated centuries ago not because their abilities made them too valuable to remain free, as history records, but because their gifts carry within them the seeds of apocalypse. The revelation hung in the air like a poisonous cloud as Lord Malachar continued, his voice taking on the weight of someone sharing knowledge that had been carefully guarded for generations. The healing gift is not stable, Lord Nightfall. It evolves, transforms, inverts itself as the bearer reaches full magical maturity. What begins as the power to cure becomes the power to corrupt, to spread supernatural plagues that can destroy entire species. His black eyes fixed on the staircase where Ember and Seraphina hid, as if he could see through stone and shadow to pin them with his terrible gaze. The council's robes rustled like the wings of carrion birds as they shifted position, revealing glimpses of artifacts and weapons that spoke of preparations made long before this confrontation, and Ember realized with growing horror that this wasn't an impromptu visit but the culmination of careful observation and planning. Every Bridgeblood in recorded history has undergone the same transformation, another council member intoned, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief and terrible knowledge. Between the ages of 20 and 25, their healing abilities reverse completely. They become plague bringers, walking sources of supernatural disease that can corrupt vampire blood, turn werewolf healing into rotting death, and spread magical cancers that consume everything they touch. The words hit Ember like physical blows as she realized the implications. She was 19. Approaching the exact age range where her greatest gift would become her greatest curse. The last Bridgeblood to reach full transformation killed 17,000 supernatural beings before we could stop her. She spread a magical plague that turned healing magic itself into a weapon of mass destruction. "You're lying," Seraphina whispered from beside Ember, but her voice lacked conviction as the terrible logic of the council's words began to sink in. The historical records, the accounts of Bridgeblood elimination, they all speak of the threat they posed, but never specify the nature of that threat. Lord Malachar's laugh was devoid of humor, carrying instead the bitter weight of someone who had lived through horrors that haunted him across centuries. Because we learned that knowledge of the transformation could accelerate its onset. Bridgebloods who knew their fate often triggered the inversion early through desperation or deliberate choice. Better to let them live in ignorance and hope for a different outcome than to create the very catastrophe we sought to prevent. His gaze seemed to bore through the manor's walls to find Ember directly. But this one has already begun to show the signs. The reversal of her healing gift when she defended herself, the way her power flows backward to cause harm instead of preventing it, these are the earliest symptoms of the inversion process. The memory of her confrontation with Lord Malachar weeks ago crashed over Ember like a supernatural tsunami as she realized the truth in his words. She had reversed her healing gift, had poured accumulated pain and suffering back into him instead of absorbing it, and the ease with which the reversal had occurred should have terrified her instead of empowering her. "The transformation is inevitable," Lord Malachar continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty born from centuries of observation and experience. Every Bridgeblood who has ever lived has followed the same pattern: exceptional healing abilities in youth, growing power and confidence in their gift, then the gradual realization that they can hurt as easily as heal, followed by the complete inversion that turns them into living weapons of supernatural destruction. His words painted a future so horrifying that Ember felt her gift recoil within her, as if her own power was rejecting the possibility even as she recognized the terrible logic of his explanation. She will be taken into council custody not for study and exploitation, but for containment and mercy, Lord Malachar declared, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence disguised as salvation. "We have facilities designed to minimize the damage when the final transformation occurs, ways to ensure that her inevitable corruption affects as few innocent lives as possible. The girl herself will be treated with all the dignity and comfort we can provide, but she cannot be allowed to remain free when her very existence threatens the survival of every supernatural being in the region. The clinical coldness of his words was somehow worse than outright cruelty, because it spoke of decisions made with full knowledge of their cost, of mercy that looked exactly like condemnation. We have been watching her since her powers first manifested, hoping against experience that she might prove different, but the recent escalation of her abilities confirms our worst fears. The word containment sent ice through Ember's veins as she understood its true meaning. They planned to imprison her not as punishment for crimes committed, but as prevention of atrocities she had yet to perpetrate. It was a prison sentence based on future crimes, a life destroyed because of what she might become rather than what she had done. Seraphina's grip on her hand tightened as the vampire girl whispered urgently, "They could be wrong. Just because other Bridgebloods transformed doesn't mean you will. You're different, you're half vampire, half human. Maybe that changes the equation." But even as Seraphina spoke the words of hope, Ember could hear the doubt in her half-sister's voice, the terrible recognition that the Council's logic was sound even if its conclusion was unacceptable. "I won't let them take you," Seraphina continued with fierce determination. "Father won't let them take you. We'll find another way, a cure, something that breaks the pattern." But Ember had seen enough of supernatural politics to know that even Theron's considerable power meant nothing against the combined might of the High Council, especially when they believed they were preventing an apocalypse rather than simply exercising control. They commanded armies of vampire warriors, wielded magics older than human civilization, and possessed the moral certainty of those who had witnessed the horrors they sought to prevent. Defying them meant certain death for everyone at Ravencrest Manor, and the knowledge that her presence was endangering the family she'd only just found made her chest tight with familiar guilt. "I won't let you sacrifice your family for me," Ember whispered back, her mind already forming desperate plans even as the Council's words continued to reshape her understanding of her own nature. If she fled now, before the transformation could occur, she might be able to disappear into the wilderness where her inevitable corruption would harm no one but herself. Before either girl could move, Theron's voice rang through the foyer with the authority of ancient nobility facing an impossible choice, his words carrying the weight of a vampire lord who had decided that love mattered more than survival. "The Council's wisdom is acknowledged, but I invoke the right of sanctuary. Ember is under my protection as family who has rendered invaluable service to House Nightfall. Any attempt to remove her violates the oldest laws of vampire hospitality." The pronouncement sent shocked murmurs through the council members, because invoking sanctuary against the High Council was tantamount to declaring war against the most powerful supernatural authority in existence. Furthermore, Theron continued, his voice gaining strength as he committed fully to his course of action, "If the threat is transformation rather than inherent evil, then the solution is prevention rather than imprisonment. We will find a way to halt or reverse the inversion process, to prove that Bridgebloods can master their gifts rather than be mastered by them." Lord Malakar's eyes narrowed to deadly slits as he processed Theron's defiance, his ancient features showing genuine surprise at the vampire lord's willingness to risk everything for a girl he'd only recently discovered was his daughter. "You would risk your house, your remaining daughter, your very existence for a human girl whose transformation could destroy everything you claim to protect?" he asked with the tone of someone genuinely trying to understand incomprehensible behavior. "She is no mere human," Theron replied firmly, his voice carrying love and determination in equal measure as he acknowledged Ember's true parentage before the most powerful supernatural court in existence. "She is my daughter, flesh of my flesh, and I protect my family above all else, regardless of the cost. If her gift is destined to invert, then we will find a way to change that destiny. If transformation is inevitable, then we will prove that inevitability is simply lack of imagination." The council exchanged glances that spoke of calculations and consequences, their ancient minds processing the implications of Theron's public acknowledgement of Ember's parentage and the political protections that recognition would provide. "Your paternal feelings are understandable," another council member said with something that might have been sympathy, "but they cannot override the safety of our entire species. The girl's transformation will occur regardless of your love for her, and when it does, your protection will become meaningless against the plague she will spread." The council member stepped forward, her movements suggesting lethal grace as she prepared to enforce their will despite Theron's objections. We have waited and watched, hoping for a different outcome, but the signs are undeniable. The reversal of her healing gift, the growing instability of her power, the way supernatural energies respond to her presence, all of these indicate that the transformation has already begun. Then give us time, Ember said suddenly, stepping into view on the staircase with Seraphina beside her, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present including herself. If the transformation is inevitable, if I'm destined to become the monster you fear, then what harm is there in allowing me a few weeks to prove you wrong? If you're right, you can claim me then with the satisfaction of knowing you offered mercy. If you're wrong, you'll have prevented the unnecessary destruction of an innocent life. Her words carried the desperate logic of someone bargaining for time she might not deserve, but beneath the fear was genuine curiosity about the process the council described. Let me study the historical records, understand what happened to previous Bridgebloods, see if there are patterns that might be broken or reversed. If my fate is truly sealed, then at least let me face it with full knowledge rather than ignorant terror. The silence that followed stretched like a chasm between worlds as the council considered her proposal, their ancient minds weighing the risks of delay against the potential benefits of cooperation. Lord Malakar's expression was unreadable as he studied Ember's face, searching for signs of the corruption he believed was already taking root in her system. 3 weeks, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could doom or save countless lives. We will grant you 3 weeks to study our archives, to understand the true nature of your heritage, and to attempt whatever reversal you believe possible. But know this, at the end of that time, willing or not, you will come with us. The risk to our species is too great to allow sentiment to override necessity. His black eyes held no malice, only the terrible certainty of someone who had made impossible choices before and would make them again if required. As dawn light slanted through the mansion's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to presage the darkness ahead, Ember felt her heart break with the knowledge that Theron's noble gesture had bought them time but not safety. The council's revelation had recontextualized everything she thought she knew about her gift, her future, and her place in the supernatural world. She wasn't just a healer who might be exploited. She was a potential weapon of mass destruction whose very existence threatened the survival of every supernatural being in the region. The peaceful sanctuary she'd found at Ravencrest Manor was about to become a laboratory where she would race against time to prove that destiny could be changed, that love could triumph over genetic inevitability, and that sometimes the greatest healing required not the power to cure but the courage to transform the very nature of what it meant to be cursed. The ancient powers filing out of the foyer carried with them the weight of centuries of failure, but they also carried the faintest glimmer of hope that this time, perhaps, things might be different. Chapter 6: The Battle for Freedom. The first attack came at midnight, when shadows moved wrong and the manor's protective wards screamed warnings that pierced the darkness like sirens. Ember jolted awake in her silk-sheeted bed as explosions of silver light flashed outside her windows, followed by the unmistakable sounds of supernatural warfare, inhuman roars, the clash of weapons forged from moonlight and starfire, and Theron's voice shouting orders to his household guards. Through her bedroom window, she could see council enforcers in their midnight armor advancing across the manicured lawns, their movements too fast for human eyes to follow as they overwhelmed the manor's outer defenses. They'd come not to negotiate but to take her by force, and the realization that people were dying for her freedom made Ember's chest tight with guilt and terror. Ember. Seraphina burst through the door, her face pale but determined as she grabbed weapons from a hidden armory Ember hadn't known existed. Father's holding them at the main hall, but there are too many. We need to get you out of here before. The wall exploded inward in a shower of marble and crystal as a council enforcer materialized from shadow itself, his midnight blade aimed directly at Ember's heart. But Seraphina moved faster than thought, her vampire nature finally showing its true power as she intercepted the attack with reflexes that blurred the air around her. The clash of their weapons sent shockwaves through the room, and Ember realized with stunning clarity that the gentle girl who'd become her sister was also a warrior trained in supernatural combat. Go! Seraphina shouted over the sound of steel meeting steel, her crimson eyes blazing with protective fury. "Father has an escape route through the wine cellars, find him and run." But Ember couldn't move, couldn't abandon the people who'd risked everything to protect her, couldn't let others pay the price for her existence. Her gift was stirring in response to the violence around her, reaching toward the injuries being inflicted in her name, and for the first time since discovering her abilities, Ember wondered if healing was the only thing her power could do. In the manor's grand foyer, Theron fought like a force of nature unleashed, his vampire strength and centuries of combat experience turning him into a whirlwind of destruction that held the council's forces at bay through sheer determination. But even his legendary prowess couldn't overcome impossible odds forever, and Ember could see exhaustion beginning to slow his movements as silver weapons left burning wounds across his marble-pale skin. "Where is she?" Lord Malakar's voice boomed through the chaos, his ancient power making the very air tremble with authority. "Surrender the bridge blood, and your deaths will be swift. Continue this foolishness, and I'll make your suffering last centuries." Theron's response was a renewed attack that sent 3 enforcers flying through stained glass windows, but Ember could see the desperation in his crimson eyes. He was buying time he didn't have, holding ground he couldn't keep, fighting a battle he couldn't win. The sight of his blood staining the marble floors made something deep in Ember's chest crack with anguish and rage. "Stop," Ember said quietly as she descended the grand staircase, her voice somehow carrying over the supernatural battle with crystal clarity. The fighting ceased as every eye turned toward her, the council enforcers stepping back while Theron's face twisted with protective terror. She looked nothing like the frightened girl who'd hidden in abandoned warehouses. Power radiated from her silver eyes with an intensity that made even Lord Malakar take notice, and the air around her shimmered with energies that defied classification. "You want me," she continued, each word resonating with newfound strength. "Then face me directly. Stop hiding behind armies and ultimatums, and prove you're worthy of what you're trying to claim." Lord Malakar's laugh was like ice cracking in winter wind, but beneath his amusement was genuine surprise at her audacity. "A human child challenges the High Council? Your arrogance will make your correction all the more satisfying." But as he stepped forward, his ancient power pressing against her like a physical weight, Ember smiled with terrible understanding. Her gift wasn't just about healing anymore. The moment Lord Malakar touched her, intending to drain her defiance along with her consciousness, Ember's power exploded outward with the force of a supernatural supernova. But instead of absorbing his attack, her gift reversed its flow, pouring every injury she'd ever healed, every pain she'd ever absorbed, every ounce of suffering she'd processed back into the ancient vampire lord with compound interest. Lord Malakar's scream shattered windows throughout the manor as centuries of accumulated agony flooded his system, while his fellow council members staggered back in shock at seeing their leader brought to his knees by a mere human. "Impossible," one whispered, but Ember was just beginning to understand the true scope of her abilities. She wasn't just a bridge between supernatural species, she was a conduit that could channel and redirect any form of magical energy, making her simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous being in their world. "I won't be your weapon," she declared, her voice carrying power that made the ancient walls tremble. "And I won't let you hurt my family. Find another way to maintain your precious order, because this girl is no longer available for your collection." As Lord Malakar collapsed in unconsciousness and his enforcers retreated in terror, Ember finally understood why her bloodline had been eliminated centuries ago, and why she might be the key to changing the supernatural world forever. The High Council's retreat left Ravencrest Manor scarred but victorious, its marble halls bearing the marks of supernatural warfare while morning light streamed through shattered windows like golden hope. Ember stood in the ruins of the grand foyer, her silver eyes still glowing with residual power as she surveyed the aftermath of the battle that had changed everything. Lord Malakar lay unconscious at her feet, his ancient features peaceful for the first time in millennia as her reversed healing had forced him to experience every act of kindness he'd forgotten, every mercy he'd ignored in his long existence. The other council members had fled rather than face the same fate, but Ember knew this victory was temporary. She'd humiliated powers older than civilization itself, and they wouldn't forgive or forget. Yet for the first time since discovering her gift, she felt truly in control of her abilities, understanding that healing and harming were simply different expressions of the same fundamental force. Theron approached her carefully, his crimson eyes filled with awe and concern as he studied the girl who'd just redefined the balance of supernatural power. "You could have killed him," he observed quietly, noting how Lord Malakar's breathing remained steady despite his unconscious state. "Your power was strong enough to stop his heart, but you chose mercy instead." Ember nodded, surprised by her own restraint in the face of centuries of potential revenge. "He experienced everything I've healed over the years, every kindness, every moment of relief, every life saved. Maybe it will remind him what power should be used for." Her voice carried wisdom beyond her 19 years, earned through suffering and refined by love. "Besides," she added with a slight smile, "killing him would make me no better than the council. I won't let their cruelty poison what my gift was meant to do." Seraphina appeared at her father's side, her vampire healing already closing the wounds she'd sustained defending their home, and the pride in her crimson eyes made Ember's chest warm with belonging. "What happens now?" Seraphina asked, voicing the question that hung in the air like smoke. "The council would eventually regroup and return with greater force, bringing armies and weapons designed specifically to counter Ember's abilities. Staying at Ravencrest Manor would only endanger the family who'd given her sanctuary, but fleeing would mean abandoning the first real home she'd known since her exile." "We adapt," Theron said firmly, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd survived centuries by embracing change. "Ember has proven that the old ways of thinking about power need to evolve. Perhaps it's time for the supernatural world to have new leadership, leaders who understand that strength comes from protection, not domination." His crimson eyes met Ember's silver ones with an expression that mixed paternal love and revolutionary determination. "If the council wants a war over your freedom, they'll discover that some of us remember what honor means." The sound of approaching vehicles made them all tense until Ember recognized the engine signatures, not council enforcers returning for revenge, but something else entirely. Through the shattered windows came a procession of cars bearing the emblems of various supernatural houses, vampire lords and ladies who'd heard whispers of the night's events and come to see the aftermath for themselves. But as the nobility emerged from their vehicles, Ember realized these weren't enemies come to capture her, they were potential allies drawn by news that someone had finally stood up to the High Council's tyranny. "Lady Ember," called Countess Valentina Blackthorn, her ancient voice carrying respect rather than the calculating greed Ember had grown accustomed to. "Word of your victory has spread through every supernatural court in the region. There are those of us who've grown weary of the Council's heavy-handed rule, and your display of power suggests new possibilities for our future." As noble after noble approached to offer alliance rather than demands for her service, Ember felt the shape of her destiny shifting like continental plates finding new positions. She was no longer just a healer hiding in shadows or a prize to be claimed by the highest bidder, she'd become a symbol of change in a world that had remained static for centuries. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, movement in the shadows beyond the gathered nobility caught her attention. A figure watched from the tree line with golden eyes that burned with predatory intelligence, too distant to identify but close enough to radiate menace that made her gift stir uneasily. The council might have retreated, but other powers were taking notice of the girl who could challenge ancient authority and survive. "The revolution starts today," Theron murmured, following her gaze toward the mysterious watcher. "But every revolution creates new enemies, and some threats make the council look like amateur politicians." As the sun climbed higher over the battle-scarred manor, Ember realized her victory had only opened the first chapter of a story that would either reshape the supernatural world or destroy everything she'd come to love. The mysterious figure in the shadows smiled with too many teeth before melting back into the forest, leaving behind only the promise that greater dangers were already moving to claim the bridge blood who dared to defy the natural order.